Now we're joined by Muhammad Faisal, Executive Director at Core Indonesia. With the recent release of data on economic growth, there are many trends emerging from several regions. So first, let's take a look at the global economic data from the US. We can see inflation continuing to rise. So what impact does this have on economic growth? Yes, so we can take a look at the graph right here. We can see that inflation in the US is continuing to rise. So what impact does this have on economic growth in the US for 2022? Mohammed Faisal.
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for having me. So if we look at these data, it's very obvious that there is a substantial slowdown in all three largest economies in the US and also EU and also China in 2022 compared to the previous year, 2021. The deceleration is expected to continue in 2023 this year. But if we look at the combinations between the GDP growth and also the inflation, we can see some differences between the US and the European Union and China. In the US and the European Union, we can see that there has been a decline in the economic growth in 2022 because of the increase of inflation. And we can see that the inflation has hits the record high in 2022, especially in the mid 2022, because of the Russia and Ukraine war that has boosted the energy prices. So we can see the factors that slow down the US and economy and EU economy is actually because of the inflation. But if we look at China, the story is a bit different because the inflation is basically low in China because of the slowdown in China is because is due to more of the COVID-19 increase in the biggest economy in Asia. And that's why the inflation has been low, because the domestic consumption is also declined because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we can see that these differences may also determine some differences of the trend in 2023, especially if we look at the recent progress, recent development in China, where the government has already removed the zero COVID policy. And we can expect in 2023 that there will be an acceleration or an increase of economic growth in China, and will be followed also by an increase in inflation. While in the US and EU, we might still see some slowdown, even though it is still uncertain on the magnitude of the economic slowdown in those two regions.
All right, thank you for that. So moving on to the European Union, as you mentioned, they're slowing down due to a lot of their oil and gas issues with Russia and Ukraine war.
Yeah.
So if we look at the graphics, there's also a clear upward trend of rising inflation in the EU that is much faster compared to the US. So how does this impact the European Union's economic state as of right now?
Yeah. This is what makes it different between the European Union and the US, because European Union is depending more on the energy supply from Russia and also Ukraine, while the US is more or less self-sufficient, or maybe they also import a little bit of oil and gas, but not as much as that imported by the European Union. So still exists. I mean, the war between Russia and Ukraine is still going right now. I think the potential of the European Union's economy is still, under pressure, is still apparent, I think, in 2023. And also, I think if it can last for several quarters, I think it will also impact on domestic consumption and also the job creation in the European Union.
All right, so moving on to China, as you mentioned, there is less demand due to a lot of the COVID restrictions in the past. So if we take a
Mhm.
look at their graph, we see more of a downward trend in both economic
That's right.
growth and inflation. So how does the
Mhm.
inflation trend impact a slowdown in economic growth in China?
Well, as I said, the low inflation is mainly due to the spread of COVID-19 pandemic, and which is responded by the government with a zero COVID policy, and that's why inflation is also very low because of the low domestic consumption in China in 2022. But if we look at the trend from the pre-pandemic in 2019, where the GDP growth in China before pandemic is actually already reached 6%, and only reached 3% in 2022. It means that actually the slowdown in China actually has happened even before the pandemic has come in 2020. So in 2023, with the removal of the zero COVID policy by the Chinese government, I think we can expect that the domestic consumption will increase, and that will also boost imports from other countries, including from Indonesia. So we can expect that export to China can increase in 2023, and that will also maintain the level of export or export performance by Indonesia amid the challenges of a slowdown of demand in the US and also in the European Union.
So bringing it to Indonesia, you mentioned we'll see more of a Chinese-Indonesia trade. So how, with Indonesia's last year's GDP growth of 5.31%, the highest record since 2013, what impact does the current state of the global economy have on Indonesia's economic state and inflation?
Well, basically, Indonesian economy is relatively resilient to the global pressure because Indonesia has a large, huge domestic market and less integrated with the global economy. So the most important factors that contributed to the high GDP growth in 2022, reaching 5.31% for Indonesia, the most important factors is actually the increased mobility that has boosted domestic consumption. Even though if we look at other sources of GDP growth, for example, government spending has declined in 2022. So with these conditions, I think as long as there is no more restrictions on people's and goods mobility in Indonesia, I think the domestic consumption is still strong. However, if we look at or we can compare the growth in 2022 and the pre-pandemic era, we can notice that actually the level of consumption, domestic consumptions, and also investments remains below the pre-pandemic era. So it has not fully recovered from the pandemic, actually. So that's the thing that we have to note. And then the other factor is also an external factor that has contributed to not just reach 5% of growth in 2022, but 5.3 is because of the commodity prices that hits its highest level in 2022, and that has made our export growth reach double digit. Nevertheless, that's not the only factor, actually, not just commodity prices, because if we look at the export performance for manufactured goods, for example, especially and iron and steel, I think has also spiked in the last 3 years. This is because of the domestic regulations and policy, especially on the development of the downstream industry, particularly nickel. So the downstream industry of nickel mining has increased the exports of iron and steel, especially to China, and that has contributed to the very high level of growth for exports this year, apart from the contribution of commodity prices.
Thank you, Ms. Faisal. And we'll talk more about the windfall of commodity prices in the next part of this dialogue. For now, bringing it back, how can we compare Indonesia's performance to other ASEAN countries in the region? So if we take a look at the graphics with the ASEAN countries, we can see that Indonesia is performing quite well. If we take a look at the graphics of the ASEAN graphics, we can
Yes.
see.
Yep. Yeah. Actually, the ASEAN amongst ASEAN is Indonesia. Again, Indonesia is one of the most resilient countries among the peer countries in ASEAN, because again, Indonesia is actually less integrated to the global economy compared to, for example, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, and not to mention Singapore. So whenever there are pressure on global economy, that will significantly or more significantly impact on these our neighboring countries, especially Singapore and Vietnam and Thailand. But again, if we look at the recent development in 2022, Vietnam, for example, has recovered quickly, even quicker than Indonesia. It means that actually the domestic policy that has been trying to contain the widespread of COVID-19 has also succeeded. So my point is that the response, government response for the respective countries to COVID-19 pandemic, and also how they can also respond to the global economic challenges is very important, and that what has make a difference between Indonesia and and also other ASEAN countries with the other emerging countries outside Southeast Asia.